So sort of to set the scene a bit, so compared to goal scoring, passing in women's football hasn't really historically received much attention. And when those studies have been done, like in goal scoring, they've quite often been very sort of juxtaposed, looking at men's versus women's football. And furthermore, they kind of like assumed that women's football is very homogeneous. So, just treating all women as the same rather than like looking at different competitions. Some of that's because of just a limited amount of data. So maybe you've only got the NWSL or the WSL or just like international competitions. So some of it's, just a lack of data and also just a sort of the design of the studies to some extent, I guess. But, that sort of raises a question in terms of, well, we don't generally assume that all men's football is the same, right? If we said that Serie A and the Bundesliga, it's the same, nobody in the men's game, nobody would actually take you seriously. Like there are obviously kind of tactical differences and all this kind of stuff. There's the culture around it and all that kind of stuff. So, what I want to kind of try and unpick a little bit today is some of those differences across the women's game. Are there differences from competition to competition? And at StatsBomb now, we have a pretty sizable amount of data from different women's leagues, both domestic and international. So that means that we can actually try and test some different things. We can build models based on more domain-specific input data, and we can sort of test some of the applicability of training models on men's and women's football and how they transfer across both genders and different competitions. Obviously, we do expect like quite a lot of transferability across models, like in terms of what they've been trained on. Football is football after all, but we would expect some biases, whether that's based on gender or different competitions, like the styles of the leagues, etc. So our primary focus is going to be profiling passing in different women's competitions and the teams within them. So previously at Wembley. There we go. So I picked this because hopefully people remember it. But also sublime pass from Kira Walsh there to put England 1-0 up in the final. Very nice finish as well. So I picked that because it sort of illustrates a little what we're trying to do here. So the first step is trying to model pass completion, so whether a pass was completed or not. This is the passing move from our IQ platform. So to contrast a couple of different types of passes and what we're trying to do. So this pass in the build-up is from Georgia Stanway to Kira Walsh. Very short pass, slightly backwards, not pressure like immediately on the ball. You would expect that to be a pretty easy pass, right? So what we're going to try and do with our model is, okay, can we put a number on that? Can we put a probability of that pass being completed? To contrast with that, Kira Walsh's assist. So the reason we describe it as sublime or any other sort of terminology, right, is because we know this is a difficult pass from having watched football. It's quite a long pass. It's very direct, like in terms of going forwards. You're going through both the midfield and defensive lines. So again, can we put a number on that in terms of how difficult it is, and then sort of draw some analysis from that, and look at players and teams, etc. So one of the sort of problems when we do try and come to model pass completion is that we're very much focused on what is actually observed rather than what's intended. We can't read the mind of players in terms of, okay, who were they trying to pass the ball to, where were they trying to pass the ball to. A lot of the time you can, obviously, you can literally see who they pass to, or you can kind of infer it from watching the game, but you do have like a subset of passes where that's harder. And one of the things, because we're just reliant on observing what happened, is when you plot pass completion rate against the length of a pass, you get this weird sort of relationship where very short passes are apparently very hard to complete. Apparently, professional footballers can't pass it like 2 yards, which seems unlikely. I'm going to reckon, if you get to top-level football, you can probably pass it. I mean, I can pass it mostly, 2 yards, just about, And also the other thing is that overhit passes tend to introduce bias because for example, if you're crossing the ball into the box, everybody misses it. It goes out on the far side touchline. That looks like a very long pass that has been failed. So you get like a sort of steeper drop-off maybe with distance than you might otherwise if you actually sort of knew who they were trying to pass to. You counted for, they're trying to hit the striker on the penalty spot, for example. So just to illustrate that sort of observation bias in the data. So Lucy Bronze here is on the right. She's looking to pass the ball down the line to Beth Mead, we can kind of infer that, that's our sort of what we think is the intended receiver of the pass. But obviously, she's under pressure from this German defender. So this is actually what the pass ends up looking like in the data. It's blocked. So all of a sudden, it looks like Lucy Bronze can't complete like a 1-yard pass. And, you build that up in our data. That's what the relationship looks like, which is obviously kind of daft in terms of what we're trying to do. We don't want to just drop out those passes. We want to try and, fill in and understand a bit more what's going on. So we do that in a couple of different ways at StatsBomb. So we collect the intended receiver of a pass, where it's known, like that pass that I just showed. But for about 5% of passes, that's not really possible. We can't infer who they were trying to pass to. So we need to deal with this portion of the data. So we're going to do that as part of our modeling process. So we're going to model pass completion as a two-step problem. So the first is to predict the XY coordinate for failed passes where we don't know the receiver. And the second bit is to predict pass completion using that intended target, whether that's the actually collected or the predicted. And by filling in a process known as imputing, as we're doing here, the missing target information, we can reduce the impact of this, this observation bias that is illustrated on the right. The models are trained on information on the start location of the pass, angle, distance, height, pressure, and also context features like was it an open play, corner, throw-in, all that kind of stuff. When we do that imputation and sort of fill in those kind of harder to predict passes, etc., and also account for the sort of collection stuff, the collecting the intended recipient, we get this relationship. So we sort of correct things on that very low end, makes more intuitive sense in terms of pass completion over very short distances. And we also don't get as much of a steep drop-off with distance. So in terms of the experiments we're going to do, we're going to train each step in our modeling process with different proportions of women's and men's data and test out how they perform. So the training data size is kept the same. The same evaluation data is used. And we're going to evaluate both the sort of model performance overall and also the women's data only. For the two models, so we trained a random forest and XGBoost model for the target imputation and the pass completion models, respectively. And the training set is drawn from the big 5 Euro leagues in both men's and women's football, plus their American counterparts, so the NWSL and the WSL. And what we're hoping is that by accounting for, by having a more sort of different spread of data from men's and women's games, we'll be able to sort of capture things like this on the right-hand side. So the base rate pass completion in women's football is a little bit lower than in men's. One of the drivers of this is pass length. So we see a similar kind of relationship with pass length. It does drop off a little bit more steeply with distance in the women's game. So we're going to try and account for that when we're doing our modeling. So this is some of the model evaluation. So this is just on women's data only. So along the bottom of each plot is the proportion of women's data that the model sees at training time. So going from 0 to 1, 0 being all men's data, 1 being all women's. On the left-hand side is our target imputation model. So that's the one that's filling in the blanks when we don't know who the intended recipient of the pass was. And on the right is the pass completion model evaluation. So both of these metrics, mean absolute error and Brier score, the lower they are, the better the model. So as you might expect, if you're evaluating this on women's data, the more women's data is in the training data, the better the model performs. That, you made it more domain specific. That makes a lot of sense. So that if you focus on the blue line first, that really illustrates that quite well. That drops off. Once you get past about 50, 75% of the data, you've got a better performing model on women's data. The inverse you see, if you look at just men's data, it's the sort of inverse of that. It's flipped around. The red line is, so that first model doesn't know whether the pass was made in the men's or women's game. So the red line is when you introduce a feature in the model that says that pass was in the men's or the women's game. And because we do that, we get better model performance. So things are all shifted down. Only did it in the 25 to 75% range because it would be a pretty useless feature if you've only got men's data or you've only got women's data. And really, for target imputation, the one on the left-hand side, is once you get to about 50-50 split and have that feature in the model, you get basically a similar performance across, having like a balanced data set versus just all women's data. Having a little bit more data in the pass completion model helps in both cases, like when we have that feature for men's and women's data. But it's kind of, we can see how obviously this isn't a surprise, this is what you would kind of expect. You've made it more domain specific and you get a better model out at the end. We can evaluate this in a few different ways, but this is looking at different leagues. So to ensure like a fair comparison here, just taking that balanced data set, 50-50 split between men's and women's data, and including that feature to say whether it was in the men's or women's game. So what we're doing here is evaluating performance across different leagues. So on the right-hand side, so we're plotting the model residuals, so that's the difference between the sort of baseline pass completion rate that we observe and the expected pass completion rate that we're getting from the model. So a value of 0 would be like a perfect model, as it were. And so that's what the red dots indicate, so that's the sort of central estimate, and we also have the error bars either side to indicate some uncertainty from the samples that we're drawing. And the first thing to kind of say is that actually there's no obvious sort of gender split in terms of how well the model performs. It's pretty well calibrated across most leagues. If anything, if there's a relationship, like maybe you could squint and say, oh, maybe there's some geographical stuff going on, or the two Serie A's are at the top there. Bundesliga is at the bottom in two of the three bottom ones. So maybe there's something there. But generally, there's pretty good performance across all the different leagues. The bigger outlier is the Frauen Bundesliga, which is, passes are significantly underpredicted, in the Bundesliga, in the Frauen Bundesliga. And so Bundesliga, your mind's going to jump to pressing, right? So I looked at, we've got a vast array of pressing sort of related metrics. They all tell a similar story, but this was the kind of clearest one for presentation purposes. So this is counter pressures per game. Each dot is a team in that league from last season. So the dots are the teams in that league, the boxes are box plots, so the ends of the box are the 25th to 75th percentile, the line in the middle is the median, and what we kind of see is, there's a lot of differences across different leagues. So for example, NWSL is right at the bottom there, not a lot of counter pressing, even for the most counter pressing-y team. Whereas you contrast that with the Frauen Bundesliga, for example, so I think it's about 6 of the top 8 counter-pressing teams as measured by counter-pressures per game are from the Frauen Bundesliga in this sample, and that sort of distribution is skewed towards the right. It's a more counter-pressing type league. The next closest one is I'm not going to try and do French, but the French league, that's kind of similar, but sort of somewhat skewed towards the right in terms of like the outliers kind of thing. So that pressing, so that probably indicates that obviously the environment in the Bundesliga is quite different to the others. Maybe that goes towards, if you've got more pressing, it's going to be harder to complete passes. That's kind of like what you'd maybe infer from this. The other thing is team strength. So there's quite a big bias from team strength. So on a per team basis, there's a strong relationship between team strength and pass completion relative to expectation. So whether you're completing more passes or fewer or less, I don't know. Relative to that expectation. And it's a pretty strong sort of relationship between them. And that's particularly evident in women's domestic football. Often like the sort of level of parity or lack of in women's football can be quite extreme. Either it's quite sort of stratified, like the WSL, you've got the sort of the big 3 kind of teams, so like Arsenal, Chelsea, Man City, you've got some sort of mid-table interlopers now, then you've got like a few weak teams and then some very poor teams quite generally. Or it can be just that, the overall league is quite sort of narrow in terms of team strength, and then you've got like a Barcelona in Spain who are just like, I think their expected goal difference is about 3 to 3.5 times better than the team in second place. So that's an extreme, difference in sort of the competitive environment. So part of again what we're looking at. So a lot of there's quite a lot of weak teams in the Bundesliga as well who are not very good at passing, and then they're also in this environment where there's a lot of pressing. So that's probably going to skew the model down further. So going back to our sunny day at Wembley. So yeah, we go back to this pass from George Stanway to Kira Walsh. So the model says that's about a 97% pass completion rate, which, maybe that's even a little low to what you might expect, but the model doesn't know everything. And then if we go back to the assist from Kira Walsh to Ella Toon, we're getting about a 24% pass completion rate, which again sort of matches I don't know how well calibrated you are to pass completion models, but that's probably not an unreasonable expectation. The model's pretty well calibrated, so it's kind of reflecting the difficulty of that pass. So now we've got that, let's do a few things, sort of drill down into the data a little bit more. So this is looking at our 6 different competitions, and so I'm plotting these heat maps of pass completion above or below expectation, split into different chunks of the pitch. So I've split it vertically into thirds, and also done some horizontal splitting to indicate like wider zones, for example. So blue colors mean that passes are completed below expectation. Red colors mean they're completed above expectation. So the Bundesliga really sticks out here. So lots of blue to dark blue, and that's particularly in like the midfield area and high up the pitch, which again you kind of associate with pressing. So that kind of makes sense. But there's quite a lot of differences from league to league, or maybe they're just more sort of uniform. But so the WSL, for example, quite good at completing passes in the attacking third. Whether that's a sort of function of the team's ability on the ball, but also teams maybe sort of sitting back more, kind of in the sort of traditional English style, I guess. But also, harder to complete passes further back along the pitch. So, again, there's like quite a lot of differences league to league, but we're smushing out a lot of signal by just averaging over leagues here. So we can look at teams. We're at Wembley. We just had the European Championships. So these are the quarter-finalists from the Euros. Again, it's the same maps, pass completion above or below expectation. This is when teams are in possession, so when they're on the ball. So this would kind of maybe indicate their sort of skill in terms of completing passes and also like what their opponents are trying to do. Spain in the top left here, they're very good at completing passes all over the pitch, particularly in those kind of wide areas and central zones in the attacking areas, but also quite bad at completing passes in their sort of right back zone, so maybe something to look at there. And France, similarly, like very good at completing passes. England, kind of, there's a bit of a sort of lopsided skew. That right-hand side was very productive, particularly high up on the right. We'll come on to it, but the sort of Lucy Bronze zone, essentially, quite good at completing passes through that central area of the pitch. And then we've also got, sort of contrast in that. We've got teams like Belgium and Austria who are broadly not very good at completing passes relative to like expectation. We can flip that around and look at out of possession. So this would be an indication maybe of, sort of types of pressing, I guess, in terms of, teams are finding it hard to complete passes against them. So these are flipped the orientation here. So the defending team are attacking from left to right. So like in the case of Spain, they're high up the pitch, very hard to complete passes against them. And also in those kind of wide areas, it's that pushing up the pitch, constricting the space, pressing, teams finding it very hard to get out against them and like complete passes from those zones. A good contrast is kind of England. So, bit more of a sort of pushing up the pitch into the final third, but then there's a lot sort of more withdrawal into their own defensive shape. Teams were completing passes above expectation in that kind of central defensive zone, sort of relative to expectation. So we're going to drill down into a couple of examples of England. So if we look in the final third, so I'm going to take our pass clustering model, which is it's a clustering algorithm that looks at the coordinates of the pass and groups them together. I'm going to combine that with our expected pass model that we just built, and also our on-ball value model, our possession value model, which you can hear about more on our data science stand downstairs this afternoon, or whenever you like, really. But yeah, so these are the 3 clusters that had the most passes completed above expectation for England. England were very good at completing passes in the final third. So the first one is sort of crosses in from the left. I've highlighted like the player with the most passes from that zone, so Lauren Hemp here. And then down the right-hand side, that really productive zone for England, we've got sort of short or medium length passes up the line, sort of progressing the ball into the final third as the second, and then very productive zone. England's most productive zone from a sort of on-ball value, chance creation kind of perspective was that right-hand side, high up the pitch cluster into the box, very much the Lucy Bronze zone kind of thing, very creative. These were the types of passes that were not only like high value in terms of like really productive in terms of like chance creation, but also England were really good at completing them as well. So it's a nice sort of combination. They're getting more bang for their buck on a per pass basis, I guess. If we flip that around and look at out of possession, we can look at similarly, we look at the passes that England's opponents were completing above average. So these are the pass clusters in that defensive zone, the defensive third, where England were more sort of sitting off and teams were completing more passes against them. And we can see with the pass clustering model now, actually those passes weren't particularly high value. They were a lot of sort of short passes, sort of circulating the ball around the penalty area, not necessarily getting into the penalty area. So, England were in that sort of defensive shell and teams were finding it hard to play through them. They had a very good defense during the tournament. So kind of putting some of those things together, you can, have a little bit more detail kind of, this is very kind of surface level kind of a few minutes slides, but you can really drill down into these things by combining different models. It's kind of the message here. So that is that basically. So profile passing in women's football. As you would expect really, the pass completion model significantly improved with more women's data and added gender context. There's pretty clear differences in model performance across different competitions, whether that's like related to team strength or the sort of different stylistic things going on, like so pressing, like particularly the Frauen Bundesliga. But and then when you look at the outputs, like those leagues and teams have quite different characteristics as well. So it's not just a homogeneous women's football. There's a lot of diversity there as well. Finally, we can try and like enrich our analysis by combining these different models of passing and applying them like at a league or team level to try and generate more insights, or hopefully do that. Thank you very much. Special thanks to Will Thompson, who did the model development work for our pass completion model and the target invitation. Joe Dragovich, who's one of our machine learning engineers who helped me a lot with getting the data together for this, and of course the rest of the StatsBomb data science team and more broadly the StatsBomb. So, thank you.